If destiny keeps giving you another chance, perhaps it is because your heart has been choosing the wrong person. The words echoed through Claire Hart's mind before she opened her eyes beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Royal Moon Hall, where hundreds of noble wolves gathered for the kingdom's grand choosing ceremony. The scent of fresh cedar, polished marble and white roses surrounded her, but none of it felt new. She had stood in this exact place twice before. The first time she believed love alone could change a man's heart, and that belief led her to an early grave. The second time she tried to outrun fate, only to discover that fear could be just as dangerous as blind trust. Now, against every law of reason, she had awakened here once more. A third life. A third beginning. Her fingertips trembled as she looked down at the silver bracelet resting on her wrist, the same family heirloom she remembered wearing before every terrible ending. The musicians played the same elegant melody she had heard in 2 forgotten lifetimes. Noble ladies whispered behind jeweled fans while powerful alpha heirs stood proudly in tailored ceremonial attire, waiting to be chosen. Every smile, every polished speech, every familiar face felt like a page she had already read. Claire knew exactly which promises would become lies, which alliances would collapse, and which charming smiles concealed ambition instead of kindness. She also knew that somewhere beyond these magnificent castle walls lived a man no one dared approach, a cursed wolf whose name had become little more than a warning passed from one family to another. Elias Thorne. In her previous lives she had never spoken to him. She had accepted the stories that painted him as dangerous, broken and beyond saving. Yet every memory that returned with painful clarity revealed something she had failed to notice before. Whenever disaster struck the kingdom, whispers always mentioned a solitary wolf seen protecting strangers from the shadows before disappearing again. Whenever innocent travelers survived impossible storms, someone quietly thanked an unknown guardian who never accepted recognition. The kingdom called him cursed because they feared what they did not understand. Claire closed her eyes for only a heartbeat, remembering the faces of those who had betrayed her trust twice before. They were standing only a few feet away, smiling with perfect confidence, believing history would repeat itself exactly as it always had. They expected her to walk toward one of them. They expected another future they could control. They expected a woman who had learned nothing. The royal herald struck the marble floor with a golden staff, and silence spread across the enormous hall. Every noble guest turned toward Claire as the king announced that she was free to choose the man who would stand beside her for the rest of her life. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, Claire stepped forward. One alpha after another straightened with quiet confidence as she passed. Murmurs drifted through the audience. She ignored every familiar smile, every expensive gift waiting to impress her, every carefully rehearsed promise of loyalty. Instead of stopping before the kingdom's celebrated heirs, she continued walking until the enormous carved doors at the end of the hall came into view. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the doors opened to reveal a lone figure standing beneath the gray afternoon sky. Dressed in simple dark clothing, separated from everyone else by both distance and silence, Elias Thorne met her gaze with guarded confusion. His gray eyes carried the quiet loneliness of a man who had spent years expecting rejection. Claire never hesitated. She crossed the final few feet between them, lifted her chin with calm certainty, and offered him her hand. For the first time in 3 lives, she chose the wolf no one else dared touch. Silence swept through the Royal Moon Hall with greater force than any shout could have carried. No one understood why Claire Hart stood beside Elias Thorne as though the choice had always been obvious. Noble families exchanged uneasy glances while the young alpha heirs struggled to hide their disbelief. Some whispered that fear had clouded her judgment. Others insisted she must have been manipulated. Claire heard every word, yet none of them mattered anymore. She had already lived through the future they still believed was waiting for them. In her first life, she had chosen a celebrated alpha whose charm captivated the entire kingdom. He had spoken of loyalty, honor, and forever. But those promises slowly disappeared as ambition became more important than love. She had ignored every warning because she believed kindness could soften any heart. It never did. Her dreams faded one disappointment at a time until the life she imagined simply slipped away. When everything finally fell apart, she realized too late that trust placed in the wrong hands could become its own prison. Then came the impossible miracle. She awoke once again at the beginning of the same year with every memory still alive inside her heart. Convinced that destiny had offered her another opportunity, she changed countless small decisions. She avoided familiar conversations. She refused invitations that once seemed important. She stayed away from people she believed had led her toward sorrow. For a while it seemed to work. The path looked different. The faces around her changed. Yet every new road somehow curved back toward the same painful destination. Different choices produced different days, but the ending remained painfully familiar. That second life taught her something far more valuable than hope. Fate could not be defeated by fear alone. It demanded courage instead. Standing beside Elias now, Claire finally understood the mistake she had repeated twice. She had spent both lives chasing the future everyone else expected her to choose. She had never stopped long enough to notice the quiet soul standing outside the light. Elias lowered his eyes as the nobles continued staring at him. Years of rejection had taught him not to expect acceptance, even when it appeared to be standing only a few feet away. His shoulders remained straight, yet there was a quiet hesitation in the way he breathed, as though he feared this unexpected kindness might disappear the moment he reached for it. Claire noticed every small detail because this time she refused to overlook what truly mattered. She offered him a gentle smile, one that carried neither pity nor hesitation. It was simply the smile of someone who had finally found the courage to make the right choice. The royal officials reluctantly completed the ceremony while uneasy conversations echoed beneath the towering ceiling. Some guests quietly left before the celebration even began, unwilling to witness what they considered a disgrace. Others remained only because curiosity had become stronger than pride. Claire paid none of them any attention. As she walked beside Elias through the enormous castle doors, cool mountain air greeted them beneath a sky painted with silver clouds. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Elias looked toward the distant forest where he had spent most of his life alone and asked in a calm, almost uncertain voice, "Are you absolutely certain you understand what everyone believes I am?" Claire turned toward him with peaceful confidence, her blue eyes reflecting the fading afternoon light. "No," she answered softly. "I finally understand what they never bothered to see." The carriage carrying Claire Hart and Elias Thorne rolled quietly along a narrow mountain road as the towering walls of the royal capital slowly disappeared behind them. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence but one shaped by two people who had spent most of their lives misunderstood in very different ways. Claire watched the forest stretch endlessly beneath the afternoon sun, and with every mile that passed, she felt herself moving farther away from the future that had trapped her twice before. Elias finally guided the horses away from the main road onto a smaller trail lined with ancient pine trees whose branches formed a green canopy overhead. After nearly half an hour, a peaceful stone cottage appeared beside a crystal-clear stream, surrounded by wildflowers, vegetable gardens, and towering oak trees. Claire blinked in surprise. This was nothing like the frightening stories she had heard since childhood. There were no signs of darkness, no abandoned ruins, no place that reflected the terrifying legends whispered throughout the kingdom. Instead, she saw neatly stacked firewood, carefully repaired fences, colorful birds resting on wooden posts, and several injured woodland animals peacefully wandering the yard without fear. A young deer with a healing leg approached Elias first, gently brushing against his hand before returning to graze near the garden. Claire smiled softly as another piece of the truth settled into place. The kingdom had feared a man whose greatest habit seemed to be caring for those everyone else overlooked. Elias noticed her expression and quietly looked away. "Most people never come this far," he said. "It is easier for them to believe the stories." Claire slowly walked through the garden, discovering rows of herbs, fresh vegetables, and flowering plants growing with remarkable care. Everything reflected patience instead of loneliness. Every corner carried evidence of someone who had built a peaceful life despite constant rejection. Inside the cottage, handcrafted wooden shelves held dozens of carefully preserved books about healing plants, ancient history, astronomy, and forgotten legends. A small fireplace warmed the room while afternoon sunlight spilled through wide windows overlooking the forest. Nothing resembled the home of a dangerous outcast. Everything reflected intelligence, discipline, and quiet dignity. Claire gently touched one of the worn books before remembering a forgotten conversation from her second life. An elderly scholar had once mentioned that the kingdom possessed only one person capable of identifying rare mountain herbs after devastating winter storms. She had never learned that person's name because no one considered the healer important enough to remember. Looking around the cottage now, she finally understood who that anonymous guardian had always been. Elias carefully placed fresh tea on the wooden table before speaking again. "You have been looking at me as though you expected to find someone else." Claire accepted the warm cup with both hands and answered honestly, "I expected to discover that the kingdom had been wrong." A quiet smile appeared across his face for the first time. It was small, cautious, and almost unfamiliar, as though smiling had become something he rarely allowed himself to do. Through the open window, gentle wind carried the scent of pine trees and wild lavender, while golden sunlight settled across the peaceful valley. Claire realized that during 2 entire lifetimes she had searched desperately for safety inside crowded castles filled with celebrated heroes. Yet the safest place she had ever found was a quiet cottage hidden in the mountains beside the one man the world had refused to understand. As evening approached, she looked toward the endless forest stretching beyond the stream, and a single thought echoed clearly inside her heart. Perhaps the greatest curse had never belonged to Elias at all. Perhaps it belonged to a kingdom that had forgotten how to recognize kindness when it stood directly before them. The next morning arrived wrapped in cool mountain air and soft rays of sunlight that filtered through the tall pines surrounding the cottage. Claire's heart woke to the sound of birds instead of whispered rumors, and for the first time in 3 lifetimes, peace did not feel temporary. She stepped outside to find Elias Thorne already tending the garden, carefully watering herbs while a pair of rabbits rested comfortably only a few feet away. The sight made her smile because frightened creatures always recognized genuine kindness long before people did. As they gathered fresh vegetables for breakfast, villagers slowly began appearing along the forest trail. Claire noticed something unexpected. Instead of avoiding Elias, several elderly residents greeted him with quiet gratitude. A little boy ran forward carrying a basket of apples and eagerly thanked him for repairing the wooden bridge after a powerful rainstorm. An older woman handed him freshly baked bread, insisting he accept it because her family would never forget the medicinal herbs he had shared during a difficult winter. Every conversation contradicted the frightening stories repeated inside the royal capital. Elias accepted every gift with humble appreciation but never lingered long enough to receive praise. Once the visitors departed, Claire finally asked the question that had been growing inside her heart. If these people know who you truly are, why does the kingdom believe something completely different? Elias looked toward the distant mountains before answering with the calm honesty she had already begun to admire. People remember frightening stories much longer than quiet acts of kindness. Fear travels faster than truth. His words settled deeply within her. They explained far more than his own lonely life. They explained the mistakes she had made during her previous lives as well. She had trusted impressive reputations instead of patient actions. She had listened to polished speeches instead of observing quiet character. That afternoon, Claire insisted on helping organize the cottage. Together they repaired shelves, sorted dried herbs, and arranged books whose pages carried generations of forgotten knowledge. While placing several ancient journals back onto a shelf, Claire discovered a faded map tucked carefully between 2 weathered volumes. The edges had grown soft with age, and unfamiliar symbols marked hidden places across the kingdom. Before she could study it closely, Elias gently folded it closed. His expression remained calm, yet a shadow briefly crossed his gray eyes. "That belonged to my grandfather," he explained. "He always believed some truths should wait until people are ready to hear them." Claire nodded without pressing further, but something inside her awakened. During her second life, she remembered overhearing powerful nobles searching desperately for an old map connected to the founding of the kingdom. At the time, she dismissed the conversation as political gossip. Now she wondered whether the forgotten document resting inside this quiet cottage was the very object they had once sought. As evening settled across the valley, the peaceful rhythm of the forest suddenly changed. A royal messenger approached on horseback, carrying the silver crest of the palace upon his cloak. He respectfully handed Claire a sealed letter bearing the king's official mark before riding away without another word. Claire slowly opened the envelope while Elias watched in silence. The invitation requested that both of them return to the capital within 3 days to attend a special council gathering concerning matters that would determine the future of the kingdom. Claire lowered the letter, and a familiar feeling stirred inside her chest. The path she had escaped was beginning to search for her once again, but this time she would not face it alone. Claire Hart could not stop thinking about the weathered map, hidden inside Elias Thorne's grandfather's journal. Even after the royal messenger disappeared down the mountain trail, the image lingered in her mind with unsettling clarity. During her second life, powerful nobles had quietly spoken about an ancient record connected to the kingdom's first ruler, claiming it had vanished generations ago. At the time, she had dismissed the conversation as another political legend. Now, standing inside the peaceful cottage where forgotten history rested unnoticed upon an ordinary shelf, she realized that some of the kingdom's greatest secrets had been hidden in the simplest places. The following morning, Elias prepared the carriage for their journey back to the capital. Claire helped secure baskets of medicinal herbs requested by nearby villages, and together they loaded supplies with an easy rhythm that already felt natural. She noticed that Elias never carried himself like a man longing for recognition. Every thoughtful movement reflected quiet purpose instead of pride. As they traveled through winding mountain roads, they stopped in several small communities where families welcomed Elias with genuine smiles. An elderly farmer thanked him for restoring an orchard damaged by harsh weather. A schoolteacher proudly introduced children who had recovered after receiving rare herbal remedies. Everywhere Claire looked, she discovered another piece of the truth hidden beneath years of fearful rumors. The kingdom had celebrated men who spoke loudly while overlooking the one who quietly served everyone. Late that afternoon, the carriage reached an old stone bridge overlooking a gentle river. Claire asked Elias to pause for a few minutes. She stepped onto the bridge and watched the flowing water shimmer beneath the fading sunlight. Memories from her previous lives returned one after another, but this time they no longer filled her with regret. Instead, they revealed a pattern she had never recognized before. Every decision that had led her toward sorrow had also kept her far away from Elias. It was as though someone had carefully guided her attention toward glittering distractions, while ensuring she never looked in the direction where the truth quietly waited. Elias joined her at the railing, resting his hands upon the smooth stone. "You seem lost in thought again," he said with gentle concern. Claire looked at him and answered honestly, "I am realizing that my past was built on carefully arranged illusions. The more I remember, the more I believe someone wanted the kingdom to fear you." Elias remained silent for several moments before quietly admitting something he had never shared with anyone else. "My grandfather used to tell me that a lie repeated for enough years eventually becomes history. He believed one day someone would finally ask who benefited from that lie." Claire felt a chill despite the warm evening air. His words unlocked another forgotten memory. She remembered overhearing influential nobles discussing an old bloodline whose existence threatened their authority. They had never spoken a name, but suddenly every scattered memory began fitting together like pieces of the same forgotten puzzle. Before either of them could continue, distant carriage wheels echoed along the road ahead. A procession carrying royal banners approached from the capital, and among the elegantly dressed passengers Claire recognized several influential council members who had shaped decisions throughout both of her previous lives. Their expressions revealed polite smiles, yet their curious eyes lingered upon Elias far longer than simple courtesy required. Claire instinctively understood that the invitation to the royal council had never been a routine gathering. Someone inside the palace had finally begun searching for the same truth that had remained hidden inside a quiet mountain cottage for generations, and whatever waited inside the capital was about to change far more than either of them had imagined. By the time Claire Hart and Elias Thorne arrived at the royal capital, the city felt different from the one she remembered. The streets were just as lively, the towering walls just as impressive, yet beneath every welcoming smile she sensed an uneasy anticipation. News of her unexpected choice had spread farther than the mountain winds. Noble families gathered along balconies to watch their carriage pass, whispering to one another as though history itself had taken an unexpected turn. Elias remained composed, acknowledging no curious glance and offering no response to quiet speculation. Claire admired that quiet strength. In her previous lives she had mistaken confidence for loudness, but the man sitting beside her proved that true confidence rarely demanded attention. Inside the palace, Royal attendants escorted them through familiar marble corridors until they reached the council chamber. The enormous circular room was illuminated by tall windows overlooking the kingdom, while ancient murals depicting the founding of the realm covered the surrounding walls. Claire immediately noticed something she had ignored in her previous lives. One faded mural showed the first ruler standing beside a silver wolf, whose eyes closely resembled Elias's. Before she could study the image longer, the council meeting began. Distinguished nobles discussed border trade, harvest reports, and alliances, yet their conversation repeatedly drifted toward the mysterious map rumored to reveal forgotten truths about the kingdom's earliest days. Several influential council members insisted that such stories belonged only to legend, while others quietly argued that history often survived inside forgotten families, rather than official records. Claire listened carefully. Every sentence confirmed what she had begun to suspect beside the mountain bridge. Someone had spent generations burying the truth beneath carefully crafted stories. During a short recess, an elderly royal archivist approached Claire with surprising warmth. His silver hair and thoughtful eyes reminded her of the scholars she had once admired. "Lady Claire," he said softly, "I have spent many years studying the kingdom's oldest records. Your companion carries the face of someone I have only seen inside ancient paintings." Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. Before she could respond, the archivist glanced cautiously around the chamber. "Be careful whom you trust. Some people seek history because they wish to preserve it. Others seek it because they hope no one else ever finds it." Without another word, he quietly walked away. Claire found Elias waiting beside one of the great windows overlooking the palace gardens. She repeated every word the archivist had spoken. Instead of surprise, a thoughtful silence crossed his face. "My grandfather often told me that our family guarded something more valuable than land or titles," Elias admitted. He never explained what it was because he believed the truth would reveal itself only when someone worthy chose to search for it. Claire suddenly remembered the faded map resting safely inside the mountain cottage. It was no longer simply an old family keepsake. It had become the missing piece connecting forgotten history, whispered legends, and the fearful reputation forced upon Elias for most of his life. As the council reconvened, the king himself entered the chamber carrying an elegant wooden case sealed with the royal crest. He placed it upon the central table, and announced that an anonymous letter had recently arrived claiming the lost history of the kingdom still existed, and that its discovery would forever change the line of succession. The room fell completely silent. Claire slowly looked toward Elias, while he quietly met her gaze. Neither of them spoke, but they both understood the same truth. Their journey had never been about escaping fate. It had been leading them toward the hidden story that fate had protected all along. The council chamber remained silent long after the king's announcement, as though every noble present feared speaking first would reveal more than intended. Claire Hart carefully studied the faces surrounding the great circular table. In her previous lives she had admired many of these respected leaders, believing wisdom naturally accompanied power. Now she noticed something entirely different. A handful of council members exchanged cautious glances before quickly looking away whenever the conversation turned toward the kingdom's forgotten history. Their uneasiness was not born from curiosity. It was born from recognition. The elderly royal archivist stepped forward carrying several fragile scrolls preserved inside protective cases. With the king's permission, he carefully unfolded the oldest document upon the polished stone table. Although time had faded much of the ink, one beautifully detailed illustration remained unmistakably clear. It portrayed the kingdom's first sovereign standing beside a young warrior whose family crest bore the image of a silver wolf beneath a rising moon. Claire slowly turned toward Elias Thorne. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same calm eyes, the same quiet expression. Even the finely carved pendant worn by the ancient guardian matched the weathered necklace Elias had carried since childhood. Whispered conversations spread across the chamber. Some nobles stared at the illustration with open disbelief while others suddenly seemed desperate to dismiss it as coincidence. The archivist continued reading from the surviving text. It described how the kingdom's first ruler had entrusted the protection of its oldest covenant not to princes or generals, but to a family whose loyalty would remain above ambition. Their reward was not a crown, but the responsibility of safeguarding the truth until a future generation worthy of it appeared. Claire felt every scattered memory from her previous lives fall into place. The stories branding Elias as cursed had never been random misunderstandings. They had slowly erased the reputation of the very family entrusted with protecting the kingdom's foundation. If no one respected the guardians, no one would ever search for what they guarded. The king quietly looked toward Elias. "Your grandfather never sought recognition," he observed. Elias respectfully lowered his head before answering. "He believed duty was still duty even when no one remembered your name." His words carried no bitterness, only peaceful conviction. That quiet dignity affected the room more deeply than any dramatic speech could have done. Claire saw uncertainty begin replacing suspicion inside many faces that had once judged him without question. At that moment, one senior council member suddenly rose from his seat. His polished voice remained calm, but his smile never reached his eyes. He argued that ancient paintings and incomplete records could not determine the future of an entire kingdom. History, he insisted, required stronger proof. Claire recognized him immediately. During both of her previous lives, he had quietly influenced nearly every important royal decision while avoiding public attention. Until now she had never questioned why. Before anyone could answer, Elias calmly reached inside his travel satchel and withdrew the carefully preserved journal that had belonged to his grandfather. Resting between its worn leather covers was the faded map Claire had discovered inside the mountain cottage. Elias placed it gently upon the council table. As the archivist unfolded the ancient parchment, several hidden royal seals appeared beneath the aging ink, perfectly matching the oldest emblems carved into the palace walls. A collective breath swept through the chamber. The forgotten map was genuine. More importantly, it connected directly to the kingdom's earliest covenant. Claire quietly reached for Elias's hand beneath the table. This time destiny had not asked her to rescue a broken man. It had asked her to believe in the truth before anyone else had the courage to see it. And at last the light that had remained hidden for generations was beginning to reach the entire kingdom. For several long moments no one inside the council chamber spoke. The ancient map rested upon the stone table beneath streams of afternoon sunlight, its royal seals unmistakable even to those who had doubted every word spoken before. The elderly royal archivist carefully compared each symbol on the parchment with the carvings surrounding the chamber. One by one, every mark matched perfectly. What had been dismissed as myth only hours earlier now stood before the entire kingdom as undeniable history. The king slowly rose from his throne, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. He turned toward Elias Thorne with quiet respect. "For generations your family carried a burden that should have belonged to all of us," he said. "Instead of receiving gratitude, you received suspicion. Instead of honor, you were given silence." The words echoed across the chamber with a weight that no title alone could carry. Claire Hart looked toward the nobles who had spent years repeating fearful stories about Elias. Many lowered their eyes, no longer able to defend the comfortable legends they had accepted without question. Even those who had opposed him most strongly now seemed uncertain where truth ended and tradition began. The senior council member who had questioned the evidence only moments before stepped forward once again. This time his confident voice had softened. He admitted that countless records had disappeared over the years through neglect, misunderstanding, and the passing of generations. Whether those losses had been accidental or intentional could no longer be fully proven. Yet the surviving map, the ancient journal, and the royal archives together revealed a history too consistent to ignore. The king nodded slowly before making a decision that surprised the entire chamber. He announced the formation of a royal historical commission composed of scholars, village elders, archivists, and council representatives to restore the kingdom's forgotten records with complete transparency. No family would again be judged by rumor alone, and no chapter of history would remain hidden simply because it had become inconvenient. Claire felt warmth spread through her heart. During her first 2 lives she had searched endlessly for justice through arguments, careful plans, and desperate attempts to change people who refused to listen. Now she realized lasting justice often began with something much quieter. It began when one person finally chose the truth instead of the easier story. After the council adjourned, nobles who had never before acknowledged Elias approached him one after another. Some offered sincere apologies. Others simply thanked him for preserving knowledge that belonged to the entire kingdom. Elias accepted every gesture with the same calm humility that had always guided him. He carried no desire for revenge and no satisfaction in seeing others embarrassed. Claire understood that this quiet grace explained why destiny had trusted his family with such an important responsibility. Power could be inherited, but character had to be chosen every single day. As evening settled over the palace gardens, Claire and Elias walked together beneath rows of ancient oak trees whose leaves shimmered in the golden light. The noise of the council faded behind them, replaced by birdsong and the gentle sound of fountains. Claire smiled as she looked toward the peaceful sky. "In my first 2 lives, I believed destiny was something waiting ahead of me," she said softly. "Now I think destiny was waiting for me to become the person who could finally recognize the truth." Elias returned her smile, his eyes carrying a quiet hope that had once seemed impossible. The kingdom had begun to reclaim its forgotten history, but an even greater change had already taken place. 2 hearts that had once walked separate paths through loneliness and misunderstanding were now moving forward together, not because fate had forced them to meet, but because they had freely chosen to believe in one another before anyone else did. Several months passed, and the kingdom slowly transformed in ways that many people had once believed impossible. The Royal Historical Commission traveled from village to village collecting forgotten journals, family records, and ancient stories that had survived only through generations of careful remembrance. With every new discovery, the same truth became clearer. Elias Thorne's family had never been cursed. They had willingly accepted a life without recognition, so the kingdom's oldest covenant would remain protected until the right time arrived. What generations had mistaken for exile had actually been extraordinary devotion. The king ordered the restoration of the ancient Hall of Guardians, where the names of Elias's ancestors were carefully engraved beside the earliest founders of the realm. Families who had once repeated fearful legends now brought their children to learn the real history instead. Teachers replaced old rumors with lessons about courage, humility, and quiet service. Claire Hart watched those changes with grateful eyes because she understood how fragile truth could become when people stopped asking honest questions. Yet the greatest change did not happen inside royal halls or historic monuments. It happened in ordinary hearts. Travelers no longer avoided the mountain road leading to Elias's cottage. Villagers visited freely to learn about healing herbs, while young apprentices eagerly asked him to teach the knowledge preserved by his grandfather. The peaceful home that had once stood hidden beneath suspicion gradually became a place of learning, kindness, and hope. Claire remained beside him through every season. Together they expanded the gardens, welcomed visitors from every corner of the kingdom, and filled empty shelves with newly written books so future generations would never again lose the wisdom that had almost disappeared. One quiet evening they returned to the old stone bridge where they had once spoken about carefully arranged illusions. The river flowed just as gently beneath the fading sunlight, but Claire felt like a completely different person. She leaned against the smooth railing and smiled toward the mountains stretching beyond the valley. "I spent 2 entire lives believing I needed another chance to change my future," she said softly. "Now I understand that I only needed the courage to choose differently." Elias looked at her with the same calm warmth that had first welcomed frightened animals and lonely strangers alike. "Sometimes destiny does not change because the world becomes different," he answered. "Sometimes destiny changes because one heart finally sees the truth." Claire reached for his hand, remembering the fear, regret, and uncertainty that had followed her through 2 lifetimes. None of those memories hurt anymore. They had become stepping stones leading her toward the life she had always been meant to find. She no longer wondered why she had been given a 3rd chance. She understood its purpose completely. She had needed those earlier journeys to recognize the quiet goodness she had once overlooked. As twilight settled across the mountains, the first stars appeared above the forest where their story had truly begun. The same gentle breeze carried the scent of pine trees and wildflowers through the valley, just as it had on the day Claire first stepped into the peaceful cottage that everyone else had feared. The kingdom would remember Elias as the guardian whose family preserved its forgotten history, but Claire would always remember something even greater. He was the man who had never allowed bitterness to replace kindness, even after years of being misunderstood. In the end, the greatest miracle was not that history had been restored, or that forgotten truths had finally been revealed. The greatest miracle was that love had found its way to 2 hearts only after they both chose compassion over fear, truth over appearance, and quiet character over empty reputation. And for the first time in 3 lives, Claire looked toward tomorrow with complete peace, knowing she had finally chosen the path that had been waiting for her all along.